with Professor Vincent Dubois from the University of Strasbourg. The talk is organized as part of the Northforsk-funded project Migrants and Solidarities, Negotiating Deservingness in Welfare Micropublics, which is a collaboration between scholars in the UK, Denmark and Sweden. I am Mette-Louise Berg and I'm the principal investigator on the project. I'm based at University College London, or UCL, and the partners on the project are based at Aarhus University in Denmark and Linköping University in Sweden. Very briefly, the project asks how solidarities are imagined, practiced and reconstituted in negotiations of migrant deservingness in the 3 countries in the study. And we take a bottom-up ethnographic approach to the question and look for textured and nuanced practices and imaginaries of solidarities and how deservingness is negotiated and with what implications in a context of increasing migration-driven diversity, welfare restructuring, ethno-nationalism and austerity. You can find out more about the project on our website, where you can also sign up for news from the project. Before I introduce our speaker, I'll just remind everyone that we are recording the lecture, but not the Q&A afterwards. And the recording will be made available on our website afterwards as well. Now, it is a huge pleasure and an enormous privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Vincent Dubois. Vincent is a sociologist and political scientist. He's a professor at the University of Strasbourg at the Institute for Political Studies. His research proposes a sociological approach to public policy, and he's currently working on surveillance and sanction policies in contemporary social states and on the relationship between the lower classes and public institutions. His critical, ethnographically produced work on welfare policy in a time of neoliberal reform and austerity has been translated into multiple languages and has been an enormous inspiration for scholars wanting to understand the real-life implications of welfare reform and how states exert power over citizens' behavior. His talk today is entitled "The Rise of Surveillance and Sanctions in the Reformed Welfare State." Vincent will talk for about 45 minutes and we will open up for questions afterwards. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you now, Vincent. Welcome again to you and welcome to all those who are attending the seminar. Thank you.
Many thanks for this invitation, for this introduction, and many thanks for everybody for being here. I'm going to share with you some elements of, oops, it doesn't work. Is it working? No. Can I share? Can you see my PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes, we can, Vincent. Yes.
Okay, because I can't. That's anyway. Okay, and if I put it like this, so I think it's all right now. So I will share with you some of the orientations and some of the results of a forthcoming book, which accounts for several years of research I have conducted on surveillance policies, monitoring practices in French welfare, which I hope at least, will be a good occasion to discuss on the notions which are at the core of the Solidarities project, that is the notion of solidarity itself and the notion of deservingness and more precisely undeservingness, even if in my talk it will be kind of implicit, and I won't elaborate directly on these notions. I think it will echo quite well to these concerns and will keep maybe for the discussion the way things I have been saying can have some interest for this collective project and the notion of deservingness and solidarities in the plural, because it has more to do with the lack of solidarity, so to speak, and with some new ways to view it and to consider the notion of deservingness and undeservingness, not only in the very traditional sense of the term related to the situations and the behavior in social life of individuals, but undeservingness as it applies to the bureaucratic practices of the welfare clients themselves. That is, when it comes to cheaters, fraudsters, or alleged fraudsters, or people who claim welfare benefits or receive welfare benefits and are, let's say, at the boundary between legal and illegal practices. So as an introduction, maybe it doesn't work again. So, as an introduction, maybe I can start with some elements on how I became interested in these questions and these questions. So it can be something that, let's say, softly introduces to the themes I will be speaking about. I first, my attention was first drawn on these questions quite a long time ago. That was precisely in 1995, while I was conducting fieldwork in welfare, in local welfare offices, the fieldwork which is presented in my book, The Bureaucrat and the Poor. And at this time, I was quite surprised, maybe at the time I was a little bit naive, I was quite surprised about the suspicion which was very important towards welfare claimants and welfare recipients, whose words, whose declarations were very often, if not systematically, put into question by low-ranking officials that we call street-level bureaucrats. So this suspicion, and in addition to this suspicion, the welfare inspectors, which I saw for the first time during this fieldwork, who conducted home investigations and who were seen as the representatives for the institution for welfare recipients, were also some kind of a mystery to me, and also a mystery to some extent to the welfare administration itself, because they were quite independent. Nobody knew precisely what they actually did when they were conducting their investigations. So that was a very empirical, curiosity about what is at stake and why these forms of suspicion towards welfare claimants at the very bottom of the state. In the meantime, that was in the summer of 1995, for the first time in France, the Prime Minister at the time, Alain Juppé, launched the first program to fight welfare fraud, which was at the time called in French pratique abusive, namely welfare abuse more than welfare fraud, and commissioned the first parliamentary report on the question, which was a key date for the process of, let's say, the officialization of welfare fraud and welfare abuse as a legitimate political problem that the state, that the government should address. And I thought that was interesting, to analyze something that was at the meeting point of the daily routine bureaucratic practices and of the political discourse and the policy discourse at the top of the state. And since I was conducting a field work at, let's say, the very bottom level, I thought it was a good idea maybe to articulate this very ethnographic local research with a more general one, and that welfare fraud could be a good occasion for that. All the more that at the time I have just read Bourdieu's Weight of the World, which has been recently published just shortly before I conducted my fieldwork. And in the Weight of the World, at some point, Bourdieu's presents some kind of general research program in which he states that we should look at the various chains of interdependence that link the very top of the state with the most precarious fractions of the social space. And again, I thought that conducting a fieldwork on the practices of welfare control, monitoring, surveillance, and sanctions, given that it was at stake in the political debates and at the highest level of the state, could be, again, a good occasion, a good way to, if not achieve, at least to follow this program briefly mentioned by Bourdieu in the Weight of the World. That's why I conducted a first fieldwork at the very beginning of the 2000s with this general orientation and with a central question on the social conditions for legal rigor. That is not only a sociology of the social uses of law, but a research question on how and why at some point there is a kind of urge to apply and to enforce the law in a more stricter way, and to whom this strict and rigorous application, enforcement of the law was precisely applied, and to what extent actually this legal rigor could be really fulfilled. That was the main basic research question at the time. And for many reasons, so I conducted other researches, and I didn't publish in full this quite comprehensive research I have done at the beginning of the 2000s. And some 15 years later, so I wanted to publish these results, which were too old to be published as such, and I conducted an additional fieldwork, quite equivalent to the first one, and which was a very good occasion, an unplanned but nevertheless very good occasion to analyze in a, let's say, historical way, at least in a 15 years period of time, the changes that have occurred in these matters in the French case. And I was lucky enough that my first fieldwork and my second fieldwork enabled me to cover the period of time during which the main changes and the main processes of turning a bureaucratic routine into a political theme and a policy concern have occurred. So I could, even with an ethnographic approach on the local routine daily practices, I could, thanks to this long period of time, account for what appeared as major changes. So the question became now, why these changes? Why did the very strong increase in surveillance, the very strong increase in the rigor with which the rules were enforced to control and sanction welfare recipients. Why did all this occur? And more generally, as I said earlier, at the beginning of the 2000s, monitoring welfare recipients suspicion, surveillance, all of this already existed. But it was not thought out by the institutions and at the general level as something which was a strong, legitimate object for a real organized policy with its own structures, its own mottos, its own orientations, and so on. And it did later. So progressively, there has been an institutionalization process, a formalization process of a policy to fight welfare fraud, and more generally to enforce surveillance over welfare recipients. So the question was simply why and how did these changes occur? So to answer these questions, there could be some, let's say, self-evident explanations, such as if there is a strong anti-welfare fraud policy, it is because there is a strong increase in welfare fraud itself, which actually hasn't been the case, and anyway, which is impossible to precisely evaluate. So this has not to do this has nothing to do with a rational response to a pre-existing social problem, namely welfare fraud. A second self-evident explanation could be that in a time when the way to consider welfare issues was increasingly obsessed with financial aspects and managerial aspects, fighting welfare fraud could be viewed as a rational answer, rational response, again, to reduce overdue payments and welfare expenses, and so more generally, public expenses. But again, even if these managerial concerns do have some impact and play a role in these changes, this is not only about and mainly about, rigorous management of public finances. First, because surveillance practices have a cost, and so let's say the efficiency is not always there. And second, because if the reason, the rationale was a budgetary one, the government, which is something very well known, should have enforced a stricter policy to fight tax evasion, which is at least 20 times more important than welfare abuse. And in the meantime, while welfare fraud was increasingly subjected to a strong surveillance and sanction apparatus, tax evasion was regarded as something which should be fought, of course, but in a much more softer way, with a decline actually of tax evasion surveillance and the rise of negotiation culture rather than of sanctioning one. So again, this explanation was not sufficient and actually not really relevant. So I don't have time here to elaborate on all the things, the fascinating things I could use in the existing literature on the paternalist turn of welfare policies, or the punitive or coercive turn, as shown by Vacan and many others, which have been influential to me. I won't elaborate either on the very general aspects which we have to have in mind to account for these changes. So the general changes in the social state, namely the workfare turn, the changes into the criteria used to grant welfare benefits and all of this does matter. But here I want to, let's say, open the black box of the actual and concrete making of these changes. And there I turn to two hypotheses, which I will say a few words about now. My first hypothesis is what I call a structural one, again inspired by the work of Bourdieu, and more precisely by Bourdieu's notion of social fields. And I don't have enough time to elaborate precisely on this, but I advocate for the use of the notion of social field to account for the social milieus in which policy are made, elaborated, decided, as a way to provide a critical sociological account of policy making rather than a mainstream approach of policy making. In this perspective, my hypothesis is that there are many social milieus, social fields involved in these changes. The political field, the bureaucratic field, the media field, the field of expertise, and again, some others. And the hypothesis here is that all these social fields are independent, have their own ways of functioning, their own internal issues, stakes, power relationship, and so on. But at some point, that each of these social fields has evolved in a way that was possibly an occasion to promote rigorous views on welfare recipients and prepare this shift towards a more coercive organization of welfare provision. I don't have the time to elaborate on all this, but this is the general idea, and the idea according to which at some point there is something like a match between these internal evolutions, changes of various social fields that could make the promotion of the struggle against welfare fraud as something which could appear as self-evident. Because of the internal struggles within the political field and the rise of some right-wing leaders who used this theme as a way to criticize the welfare system and to posit themselves as courageous, brave reformers, because of changes within the bureaucratic field with the power increasingly gained by financial departments over welfare departments, who impose them some new incentives to be more strict on welfare recipients with performance indicators and so on. Again, with the journalist field. So again, it's not just only a few examples to give you an overview of this structural hypothesis of the way these independent but also interdependent social fields could at some point work together and bring this orientation towards more efficient and more and stronger monitoring and surveillance over the poor. But this, I think it's a major hypothesis for me, but it's not fully sufficient. And I have added another one, which I would call a more interactionist hypothesis. That is, not only taking account the objective structures of power and domination processes related to this unequal distribution of positions of power, which is sort of the structural approach inspired by Bourdieu, but to account also for the concrete dynamics of the direct interactions, or at least relationships between actors. And here I propose this hypothesis of what I call the spirals of rigor. That means that at some point, when structures have been built in a way that, in the political field, for instance, the importance of welfare fraud has become self-evident. Political actors, even if they had gained important power positions, couldn't escape anymore the fact of positioning themselves as necessarily fighting welfare fraud, because it had been previously imposed as a legitimate political theme. So what I mean is that, on the one hand, there has been a strong investment by right-wing and far right-wing leaders for many reasons, including internal competition to the right. So there has been a strong investment by those political leaders to construct welfare fraud as a legitimate political theme. In the meantime, let's say the softliners were reduced in their possibility to express themselves because they appeared as illegitimate, even if they had an important position within the political field. That is, it's not the most full one who wins in the end, but the more rigorous ones. That is what I call the spirals of rigor. So a kind of never-ending investment to promote welfare fraud, and in the meantime, a decline of the positions, let's say, of the softliners who could advocate for other ways of dealing with welfare recipients and other things that could appear as more important than the one of welfare fraud. And the intermediate positions, that is, let's say, the moderate left, for instance, I mean, just couldn't do anything, even when they were in power, but, you know, going on these policies, perhaps with less rhetorical investment, but nevertheless, without any real change in actual practices. Here I take the example of the political field, but the same could more or less could be said at various levels in various fields, but also at the level of the concrete daily practices, which I will illustrate in a few minutes. So this is my general framework, and if you are interested, I can explain you how I did all these various researches at various levels of the state, and not only of the state, but now I will turn, because I think it's the most relevant for your research program and the themes you're most directly interested in. So I will turn to the local and concrete practices that also have changed in the meantime that this policy has been built. So let's turn to the local level and to the way welfare organizations went to include in their legitimate practices harsher surveillance and sanctions over welfare recipients. First, I want to say a few words about what can be called a new division of the labor of surveillance. When I conducted my first fieldwork in the early 2000s, so there were welfare inspectors, only a few of them, but apart from them, nobody actually really directly took care of surveillance and sanctions. 20 years ago, or 15 years, 20 or 15 years later, I mean, things have changed a lot. There have been many additional functions that were dedicated to monitoring, surveillance, checks, and so on. And the invention, so to speak, of these new specific functions have been key to the strengthening of the rigor with which rules were enforced, because to some extent in the division of labor internal to welfare organizations, the raison d'être and the legitimacy of these agents was defined in relation to precisely enforce strictly the law and debunk fraudsters. So it's not only about a more rational way to organize things, it has to do with the way agents define their own functions in relation to other agents within the administration. And so here, for instance, there's something which is not only the result for this new organization in itself, which is not either only the result of, let's say, pre-existing dispositions by social agents of being authoritative, not authoritarian, or being, tough or something. But it has to do, again, with the division of labor, but also with the interests, the interest they could find in their work, which is more important when it comes to debunking fraud and going into detail of a file and having a strong investigation role than just dealing on a very routine basis with many files in a much more standardized way. So all of this has to do with, again, this evolution I have been described before. There is, on the one hand, a form of specialization of the work of surveillance, but in the meantime, there's also what I call here dissemination and an enrollment of many various agents in the work of surveillance. That is, here I use the notion of institutional culture to describe the, let's say, most shared principles and goals within an institution at some point in the history of this institution. Again, at the beginning of the 2000s, surveillance and sanctions were viewed as, let's say, a necessary evil, if not a kind of dirty work. There was suspicion, as I said before, but it was not regarded as something which was at the core of the way the institution should function. 15 years later, again, there has been, in a very explicit way, the promotion of a surveillance culture within welfare offices for many reasons and under various forms, including the notion of risk management, which has played a key role in the fact that every agent in every department and service of the welfare administration, at every position in the chain of command, was supposed to have in mind the concern of fraud and of quality control and of the struggle against overdue payments and so on. So specialization on the one hand and dissemination on the other hand, which are possibly contradictory trends, but which combination leads to, again, a more effective and a much more stronger way to deal with these questions of abuse, fraud, error, and so on. These organizational changes also have to do with processes which for me are something difficult to pronounce properly in English, but let's say proceduralization, that is the fact that instead of having a way to deal with the files and the cases which was not really formally organized, a step-by-step procedure with dedicated agents, with a parcelization of tasks, and so on. So this proceduralization process, which amounts to some extent to a form of rationalization in the Weberian sense of the term, has had impacts on the way individual agents dealt with the cases they should process. First, in terms of what I call here de-responsibilization, that is, the more the division of labor is strict, the more the procedures are well and strongly established and well organized and divided, the less individual agents feel responsible for the decisions which are made on the single case. And this leads most often to more severe decisions because people don't have, the reluctance anymore to make harsh decisions, which they could have before because they felt individually responsible for this decision, because now they are only a part in a much more general and complex web of decision making. So proceduralization has to do with de-responsibilization and has to do also with what I call here de-realization. I mean here by de-realization the fact that more procedure, stricter criteria, and a technicization in the way files and cases are processed lead to the fact that the actual social situations and circumstances are not taken into account anymore. It's only about legal criteria, financial criteria, and not about the, let's say, the social aspect of the situations, which could in the past more easily been included in the decision in the sense of, let's say, excuses or more comprehensive bureaucratic attitudes. This derealization leads to the fact that in the end, if such and such criteria is not, filled, it automatically leads to a sanction without any, badge consciousness, which previously was much more the case. I'm being too long, so I leave it aside. But this new division of the labor surveillance is not reduced to the internal organizations of welfare, but has to do also with the relationship, the external relationships of welfare administrations, both with new or other segments of the state with which welfare officers previously were not into relation with. I think here of the police, of the judicial system, with which collaborations have been established and strengthened. I think of tax administration for the exchanges of information and many others, including, let's say, ordinary citizens, which have been acknowledged as, legitimate partners of surveillance policies with denunciation letters, which number have been increasing over the last decades and which are increasingly taken into account and officially included in the procedures of debunking fraud, which is nothing new in the US case or in the UK case, when the websites of any social welfare department, you have a form to report welfare fraud, but which was quite new and very new in the French case, and which gives, I think, a good illustration on the shift that these changes have been conducive to, including in the practices of, let's say, profane actors and ordinary citizens. Two quick examples of what I call the spirals of rigor. The first example has precisely to do with external collaborations. There has been a new kind of commission meeting several segments of the state again together to fight any forms of fraud, including, of course, welfare fraud, but also to some extent, but to a much lesser extent, tax evasion, and so with police services and so on. So the interesting thing about these commissions is that on a very practical and concrete way, they don't do much, but the kind of interactions that have been created by the single fact of these administrations meeting together and supposedly fight fraud together has initiated in a very artificial way incentives, new initiatives, new forms of collaborations, new needs to account for each administration's practices to fight fraud and so on. And so this is some kind of self-organized and self-fed process on almost no concrete basis at all, but in the end, which participates to this trend towards more active and stronger surveillance and sanction policies. The same can be said about an internal commission, which is the commission which is dedicated to the qualification of the cases of fraud. And then when the qualification is done, to start prosecution. And here again, the way these commissions function give a very strong advantage again to the hardliners, even if they are not the most prominent ones within the welfare organization. I see something happening on the screen. I hope everything is okay. And so even, the director of the administration, when he or she participates in this commission, can express himself or herself anymore in terms of being more comprehensive. It has become inexpressible, as opposed to the hardliners who really have gained power and who impose their view in the very internal logics, in a Goffmanian sense of the term, of the interaction. That means being soft means losing losing the face, as Goffman says. That means running the risk of appearing not a good manager or being over lenient or something. And this is something which fuels the general process of making harsher decisions and conducting more severe surveillance and sanction policies. How much time do I have left?
About 10 minutes, Vincent.
Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, sorry, I've been a bit long. So, sorry. Can you see my slide again or not?
Yes, we see it.
Yeah, okay. So, when it comes to practices, again, many changes have occurred. I just mentioned which is something very important, that is the increasing uses of many various technological tools, such as digital tools to match information or data mining, predictive statistical models. I don't have the time to elaborate on this. What I want to here to quite briefly mention is the changes in one of the specific practices of inspection and on surveillance, which is home investigations. This is one of the more ethnographic part of my research here. So some agents, inspectors, go and do preliminary investigations in the neighborhood, in other administrations, in the files of welfare clients, and so on. And they conduct investigations at the home of the welfare recipients, checking the way the apartment is organized, if there is really or not one single person in the apartment, and conducting police-like interrogations. When I conducted my first fieldwork, my conclusion or my main hypothesis was what I called the inspector's paradox. That is, the very agents who were supposed to enforce legal rigor were themselves using, if not illegal practices, at least non-legal practices and criteria to enforce the legal rigor for many reasons, such as the loosely defined criteria they should enforce, or the fuzziness and contradictions and precarious situations they should qualify with, which made them with many difficulties for them to really use only the legal criteria. And it should be a little bit too long to explain, but I can go back to it in the discussion. One of the main aspects of their work was what I called legal insecurity, not in the legal sense of the term, but in a way which was inspired by the notion of linguistic insecurity. That is the discrepancy between the goal, the objective of legal perfection, and the actual means of the agents to fulfill this dream of legal perfection. I just tell it as it is and don't explain it in full. I can go back to it if you want later. And so what was interesting to me with the notion of insecurity, of legal insecurity, was to account for the inter-individual variations of the practices, because legal insecurity was conducive to really various responses by individual agents, because their work was less guided by standard rules than by other kinds of concerns, which were more related to their own dispositions and to other factors I don't have the time to explain. Here, I only want to mention that it gave me the occasion to propose an analytical framework which accounts for the reasons for for these inter-individual variations, and so to account for the reasons and to the social factors that could explain the various uses of what is called in the street level bureaucracy literature discretion. So it's one thing to describe discretion, it's another one to explain the various ways according to which discretion is used, and that's why one of the points I try to bring in my research. So, in addition, so after the 2000, there has been many changes, as I said, in the organizations, in the training programs, in the definition of rules, and in many other aspects. And so some years later, the changes regarding these home investigations practices were first about the definition of the role of welfare inspectors and inspection in general. At the beginning of 2000s, since, as I said, the direct coercive aspect of inspection was badly regarded, there was a kind of euphemization of inspection as a means also to counsel and to provide the welfare applicants with advices, and not only about sanctioning them. In the current era, counsel has totally disappeared, and it's only about debunking fraud and making severe decisions. Another change has to do with the new techniques, that is the increasing availability of databases has led to the fact that the key aspect of inspection work is no longer during interactions, direct interactions and interviews with the clients, which are increasingly standardized and bureaucratized. The key aspect actually is the preliminary inquiries made from their offices by welfare investigators. So there's a kind of technicization of inspection work, which changes totally the way investigations really work, and change the statuses of the various practices and the general economy of these practices. An important change and a major trend is the standardization of practices, so which can be conducive to the decrease in the discretion of welfare agents. I only give you here a few illustrations. Here you have so a form which is supposedly a kind of reference to help investigators in making a decision about isolation. And so, as you see, it's from the late 1990s, 97, and so it's a very traditional one, and it's a very, let's say, rustic one, so to speak, which leaves a huge part of appreciation, leeway, room for maneuver to the individual agents. Now, it's very difficult to read, of course, on the screen, but this is an Excel file with a very important number of criteria, with ways to ponderate all the criteria, and with a kind of automatization of the decision. You can't see each really on the screen, but after the inspector has filled all the boxes, it just clicks on the upper right-hand side green button for an automatic calculation, and so the software gives an answer which dispossess to a large extent, which helps, of course, which is a support for the decision, but which dispossess the individual agents of the decision. Here, I just want to briefly mention also an illustration of the standardization processes of practices with the reports written by the investigators. Here, it's not before the 2000s, at the very beginning of the 2000s. So you see something which is handwritten, which provides concrete circumstances, the atmosphere, and so on. So, as you know, in Jack Goody's work, for instance, the materiality of writing and the role of writing in bureaucracy is of key importance, and it's a good indicator of the way the bureaucracies have changed their practices. Here, a second example of a report, which is much more formal, as you can see, and here now these are current digital reports in which everything is reduced to formal, very specific criteria, and in which you have only a very small box, commentaires or commentary here, in which so the investigator can express what he thinks or feels. That is, again, you have in the very specific, concrete bureaucratic forms the conditions that are fulfilled for what I've previously called a derealization process, not only the standardization of the practices, but also the fact that the lives of the client are fully reduced to the language of files in a much more formal way that is conducive most of the time to harsher decisions. Nevertheless, and I'm going a little bit quicker, not to be too long, nevertheless, there are still inter-individual variations. Here, I don't have the time to comment on this table, but you can see that it's, it's a table which accounts for some performance indicators of individual welfare investigators' practices, and you can see that there are important variations and differences which are related to the differences in their practices. And so here, this question has not disappeared, but it has shifted from the way investigators conducted their investigation at the home of the welfare clients and in their ability to conduct interviews, to their ability and their will to use databases. So there is still this question, but at a preliminary and very different level than previously. What I mean here as other street-level bureaucrats, authors mention, is that discretion is not a flaw in the system. It's not a limit of the organization. Discretion itself fulfills function. And maybe I stop here. First, even in the most well-organized, from a legal and managerial point of view, system, there is still some kind of discretion. And this discretion is functional because it is necessary to deal with the cases which are too difficult to interpret only with the legal and standard criteria. So it's a necessary aspect of bureaucratic practices to have this discretion. It is all the more the case that there is a kind of explicit new economy of surveillance practices. There is, as I said, an increase in the uses of technologies, of what is remote surveillance. But this has not been conducive to the disappearance of direct individual control. And here it can be some kind of a more general theoretical discussion. At least my fieldwork doesn't validate, I would say, the general thesis of Foucauldian and post-Foucauldian authors saying that, you know, now we are in an era of at a distance only surveillance and social control. But both goes hand in hand. That is, surveillance is more effective because precisely it uses mass information and way to process in an automatically a huge amount of data to find an important number of errors, but that direct control is still needed to see what the electronic apparatus can't see. And last functions of discretion and of direct interaction, it is, so to speak, a kind of moral one. That is, it's not only about finding errors, it's also about redressing behaviors. And this can be done only in the direct relationship between agents and clients, when they are being shamed, when they are being called back to their duties, when they are being reminded the need to behave properly in their lives, as well as in their bureaucratic practices, and so on. So here again, direct interactions, personalization fulfills also a necessary function, which can be fulfilled only by standardized and technological apparatus. I can stop here, or I can maybe give you some results on the effects on welfare recipients of these changes, depending on the time.
Yes, it might be quite good to, if you're able to draw it to a conclusion now, Vincent.
Okay.
Time for questions,
okay.
Please.
Sure. So, some very short results on, excuse me. So briefly, some results on the effects. So an increasing surveillance on welfare recipients, so that's pretty obvious. Harsher decisions. There's a huge increase in administrative sanctions and in prosecutions, and the very same behaviors or errors which were accepted without any prosecution like 15 years ago, now are systematically being prosecuted, and on a very much more severe basis, which these figures give an idea, but there are also many other aspects. I started with giving you an example of a possible comparison between the fight against tax evasion and the fight against welfare fraud. Here, this graph displays the statistics of the Ministry of Justice on the number not only of prosecution, but only of sentences, the strongest sentences possible in these cases. And so you have the dark line, which is sentences regarding tax evasion, and you have on the light one the evolution of the sentences for welfare fraud. And you see that not only there are harsher decisions, but to use Foucault's word, there is an increasing differentiation in the way illegalisms are managed, depending on the social statuses of those who are identified as possible fraudsters. So, and it is also the case, and then we'll end on this point, it is also the case, not only if we compare welfare claimants on the one hand and taxpayers on the other hand, but within, among the population of welfare recipients, those who are more precarious are always the more under surveillance and the more subjected to sanctions. So, and this has nothing to do with the objective actual distribution of illegal practices. This is not fully intentional, but the whole system functions in a way that in the end, it is always the most precarious and the poorest who are the most subjected to surveillance and sanctions. So maybe I can stop here. So as you see, I really try to give you insights on the very concrete and internal functioning of welfare administration in this, let's say, coercive aspect of its work. To me, it's a possible occasion to discuss more generally on changes in the way the state governs its population, to discuss about the social differentiation and maybe the increasing social differentiation in the way the state governs its population divided into social groups. And it's also a way to illustrate a very general trend in the changes in the social representation of welfare recipients, and again, to end with our starting point, to reflect on the reasons why the precarious populations in general, not only welfare recipients, but also migrants, is intensively regarded as possible cheaters, fraudsters, and undeserving persons. And on this note, I will thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vincent. A really, really rich talk with some quite powerful illustrations of the general trends. Thank you so much. We've run a little bit over time, but we do have some time for questions. So I'm going to open up for questions from, yep, there we go, from the audience. Thank you. If you are able to, you can post in the chat or